Hello, Earthlings, and welcome to the second episode of Sound Mind, where a guy by the name of Sound lets you in his mind. For those of you who are new to this series, which is highly likely, as this is only the second episode, this is where I talk about my process as a musician, going into different aspects of music and how I approach them. So this episode, I'm going to talk about my process behind my album reviews. For those of you who've seen any, you will know that I do them all track by track. That just comes out of my slight frustration at reading some album reviews that, not only don't do the tracks in order, but leave out my favorite one, which is but that's such an important part of the album, at least to me. So I want to at least mention everyone's favorite track, even if I hate it. Kind of a good example of this is on Battles' album Mirrored. My two favorite tracks are Rainbow, which is the longest, and Prismism, which is the shortest. And there's a big difference, 8 minutes versus less than 1. But they're each masterworks of polyrhythms in their own way. I mean, that entire album, Mirrored, is a masterpiece. One of the more accessible experimental rock albums of this century. I also wanted to mention specifically the two albums I reviewed in the past 2 days, California's Burnin' by Matt Jaffe and Volcano by Temples. With Temples' album, I knew their first album intimately, having gotten into them a few months after it was released, Sun Structures, that is, which is also a masterpiece, and for those of you who haven't heard it, a very 60s sounding album. I even said when it came out that it sounds 50 years older than it is. While I did love it, as with a lot of albums I consider masterpieces, I kind of hope the band doesn't try to replicate it on the next album, and that's pretty much exactly what Temples didn't do on Volcano. They brought the synths way to the fore, and I also had the added bonus of having heard some songs from Volcano last semester when I saw them at the Brighton Music Hall. And it also helped that I was a fan of their new direction, because their songwriting was as brilliant as ever. But with Matt's album, it was a slightly different story because it was his debut album, although he had put out an EP in 2014 called Blast Off. But I was familiar with that album, having heard all of the songs on it live, at least the original edition of Blast Off. I think sometime in 2015 or 2016 he replaced the song Put Your Finger in the Socket with another one called Holding On, which I haven't heard him play live yet, but then again I've only been to 3 of his shows. But I have seen a bit of the music video for Holding On, and from what I've heard of the song, I much prefer Put Your Finger in the Socket, but that's enough about the EP. As I said in the review, having heard all of those songs live, I did have some bedrock to base the review on, and I was happy to hear that he, not like hearing through the grapevine, but actually hearing from the album, that he didn't try to make it as good a quality recording as is humanly possible to keep some of the live energy of the show. As I've seen, I'm just reviewing the album again. I pretty much listen to the album, and when I know I'm going to review an album, I consciously try to make notes about every track, since I always do them track by track, and, find out what differentiates one song from another. That's the case on a lot of my favorite albums when I started consciously cataloging what my favorite albums were. Like, for a long time, my favorite album was In Rainbows by Radiohead. And, every song on that album has a very distinctive personality. And, with all the music I listened to, especially in high school, I began to, recognize certain tropes that really worked, like ending the album with a long song and then a ballad. A bit like what Temples do on Sun Structures. With Sand Dance and Fragments Light, or what Queens of the Stone Age do on Like Clockwork with I Appear Missing and then Like Clockwork. or just have a series of very different tracks coming one after the other, like the Flaming Lips did on Embryonic. Like the entire last quarter of Embryonic is has some pretty masterful sequencing, like putting a loud sort of jam Scorpio Sword into a vocoder ballad, The Impulse, and then a fast number, Silver Trembling Hands, and then Virgo Self-Esteem Broadcast, which is kind of an ambient coda to Silver Trembling Hands, and then Watching the Planets, a rocking closer. So I definitely got interested in track sequencing, which I think is definitely one of the reasons why I review albums track by track. I mean, going back to Radiohead, I saw a lot of reviews saying of Hail to the Thief, saying that it was a few songs too long, and so that begged the question, which songs could it do without? And I tried to figure out if it would sound not through actively listening to the album but deliberately skipping certain tracks, but wondering what each track would take away from the album were it not there. Like if you took off I Will, then you had no time to catch your breath between There and A Punch Up at a Wedding. Or if you took out A Wolf at the Door, then you'd have a different closing track, a much more serene one. It wouldn't leave a hint of anxiety in your ear. And you couldn't take out Sail to the Moon, because then you'd have to wait a lot longer for a ballad, pretty much the entire album. So that's another main reason why I review albums track by track. And this is currently kind of a hobby to me, because I don't really review albums that I don't particularly like. I only review ones that I've been looking forward to. And I try to do them right after they're released, which is why I'm not really doing like what the Needle Drop does with Classics Week yet. Besides, I'm hardly sure I want to make a career out of music journalism. I'm a performer, more so than a critic. But there was something else I wanted to say. You might be able to tell this from watching my reviews, but generally you can tell more about my opinion of a track by how much time, this is just something I've noticed, you can tell how much I like a track by how much time I spend talking about it, because I think that's what most people would do. Like, if they like a track, they'd, find out everything about it and tell it to everyone. Yeah, so you can tell more about what I think of a track by how much time I spend talking about it rather than the quality of my adjectives or verbs about it. But that is really all I have to say for this episode of Sound Mind. Next week, I'm going to start talking about specific songs. If there's anything any of you viewers are curious to know about that might pertain to one day being an episode of Sound Mind, leave them in the comments. Like if you like, share if you share, subscribe if you subscribe if you don't, and that is it for now. So, as I said, next week I'm going to start talking about individual songs of mine. But until then, Gafaba.